You're listening to a podcast of Spurious Morality. And now you have to wait for the rest of the episode to buffer before you can hear the rest of it. God, do you remember that with Schalke? Like, each part was split into 5 bits and you had to click through. Like, it would end a chapter and you'd have to click on to the next one and load it. I think I was still on dial-up at the time. Hello and welcome to a podcast of Spurious Morality. I'm Johnstone and with me this week I have Mansoor. Hello Mansoor.
Hello.
And we're here to talk about another sort of neglected little corner, perhaps forgotten corner of the Whoniverse, which is webcasts, which were sort of all the rage in the early noughties. Like, it was, I think it seemed like this might be the way Doctor Who was going to go or come back for quite a while. Sort of before Russell T Davies and any "it's coming back" Christopher Eccleston whatever announcement, these webcasts were kind of a little insight into what could be done, what could be achieved. And by the time they came out, audio Doctor Who was quite a big thing, and somebody thought, well, we can stick visuals to things like this and put them online, and that could be the way Doctor Who will continue. And it was, I remember watching Scream of the Schalke, and it was, for me, the very, very first weekly new Doctor Who that I could follow each week, and I thought it was absolutely fantastic. I thought it was 10 times as fantastic when it actually came back to TV and we got Rose and End of the World and so on, but Scream of the Schalke, which is obviously one of the stories we're going to talk about today, does hold a sort of special place in my heart. It's kind of an interesting little insight into what the Ninth Doctor could have been and how Doctor Who could have continued, and perhaps how it shouldn't have done as well. So before we dive in and discuss the 4 stories that we have today, which are Death Comes to Time, Real Time, Sharda, and, as I said, Scream of the Schalke, just let's have a bit of a general webcast chit-chat. So do you think they worked, Mansoor? Do you think that these webcasts were a good idea? At the time they were kind of, I guess it was kind of really, really looking to the future. They were taking the internet at a stage before YouTube, before Netflix or anything like that, and going, let's see what potential there is here. So yeah, webcasts, what thoughts do you have around them?
There's an interview on the special features of Death Comes to Time. I think it's the BBC Radio interview with Sylvester McCoy, and they've got some other guest or commentator on as well. And the other guest is being very down on Doctor Who in general returning, like a few years before Russell T Davies showed that it could be done. But also was being very down on the technology and the idea of webcasts. And Sylvester McCoy was actually being, obviously, gently sort of sticking up for it and defending it, but was being very sort of kind of forward-looking in terms of saying, look, it's an emerging technology. It's going to get better over time, and it's going to be the future. And if you think about webcasts as an early version of streaming media, that's everywhere now. Like, there are people who just have no familiarity with physical media at all, and are like a little bit confused by things like videotapes or floppy disks or even like optical disks. And so yeah, in that sense, webcasts in general, they were an emerging thing. We were talking before about how if you were accessing them on dial-up, you had to wait for each part to download, and sometimes it would time out, and sometimes it would come through as really low res, and so they weren't perfect, but they were like a first iteration of what we have now with Netflix and Disney Plus and Amazon Prime. So I think in that sense they were a massive innovation and success. And the Doctor Who one specifically, if it hadn't been for Christopher Eccleston coming back on TV, they were going to continue. Like there were going to be more Richard E. Grant stories carrying on as like an ongoing series. Um, so yeah, I think they had their issues, but they were a massive success and a big innovation.
I think it was a great way to kind of explore new technology and, the emergence of the internet. And perhaps it did come a tiny bit early. Like I say, I was definitely still on dial up when Schalke came out. But maybe, we were perhaps, broadband was becoming a thing, faster internet speeds were becoming a thing. We were kind of just on the cusp of that sort of thing becoming a little bit more mainstream. I think it took a couple of years after these webcasts for things like YouTube to start emerging, but it definitely it was there, that kind of the idea of streaming, of watching things online. It was definitely well on its way. Um, so yeah, it is interesting sort of to look at as a kind of historical use of technology, and I guess events ran away with it, Doctor Who ran away with it, technology ran away with it, and it kind of became not the norm. And I do part of me sort of wonders is this an earlier version of something that kind of fizzled away? And it happens a lot with technology. Laser discs never made it, mini discs, Betamax, HD DVDs, all of these sort of formats that were tried, were tested, and quite a few people got on board with, but ultimately it never quite settled. Um, in some ways, it's a shame that Scream of the Shalk is a standalone piece because it sets up some really good and interesting stuff, and we'll come back to that afterwards. But it's very obviously the start of a series, and it's a shame that we never really got any more after that. But I think that's a combination of perhaps the technology wasn't quite where we wanted it to be, needed it to be, and of course, Russell T Davies brought back Doctor Who. We'll jump into our first webcast for discussion then, which was Death Comes to Time, which, even though it's the first we're going to talk about and the first that came out, I've only actually seen it for the first time today. I managed to find it on YouTube, and somebody's kind of worked quite hard actually to sort of boost the quality a little bit, make it fit better on a modern screen, and it looks a bit better, it sounds a bit better. But unfortunately, they only seem to get up to part 3, and I watched the last 2 parts in the kind of original way, and there was a notable kind of drop in quality there. But nevertheless, I got the story, got to grips with it. Took me a little while to start enjoying it, but by the end, I was definitely in. I definitely did enjoy it. I certainly think it's better than Real Time for reasons I'll discuss in a little bit. But you're far, far more familiar with it than I am, so I'll let you talk about Death Comes to Time first. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think I really liked it at the time, and I still like it now. I think it's like so many things. It's like a sort of interesting, weird, sort of special event. You can see it as like a big finale to the Seventh Doctor's era, or you can see it as a kind of relaunch. So we are going to be doing spoilers for these decades-old webcasts that are like really difficult to access. But the Doctor dies, and it's kind of a setup for a Doctorless universe where Ace and all these other characters that are introduced potentially go on to have a series of adventures, and Ace takes up the Doctor's mantle and carries on. So uh, that's really interesting. That sort of ambition of saying, look, we're not gonna, um, there's a space for like nostalgia and capturing the vibe of what was on TV. You know, the whole thing about Tea Time 1975, but there's also something really exciting about doing spin-off media that just takes risks and does something different and pushes things in a new direction. And that's the kind of uh, sort of spin-off stuff that I tend to get more engaged with. And it doesn't always pay off. It's like the New Adventures. We talked about those kind of taking risks and sometimes falling flat on their face in the early days, but because they took those risks, they hit some really high highs. And I think Death Comes to Time is the same. There are bits that you might sort of question, but I think overall it still hangs together really well as a sort of ambitious and interesting piece. And it, yeah, like I said, you can view it as the culmination of the Seventh Doctor's era that we never had. Because when did it come out? Was it 2000? Was it? It was after the TV movie, so the Seventh
I
Doctor had
think
actually regenerated.
it was early 2000s, wasn't it?
Yeah,
I
before the new
couldn't tell you.
series.
Yeah.
Uh, I think it was like a couple of years after Big Finish had started, so that's the kind of context where it comes out. But it felt to me like it was like from a universe where Doctor Who didn't go off the air in 1989, and the Seventh Doctor and Ace carried on having adventures, and they got bigger and bigger in scope and built up to this really sort of epic finale. Um, and that, again, I thought that was a really interesting choice. It wasn't picking up like minutes after the end of Survival and just kind of like doing the next day from that point. It was saying, it wasn't patronizing the audience. It was just kind of going, right, a load of stuff has happened and you've just got to keep up. um, and then the actual story itself, there's so much I like about the production, like the music. It's got a very BBC radio production quality feel to it as well. Um, uh, we were talking about how you watched it with the visuals, and maybe that's like a different experience to just listening on audio, because I think they added some stuff to the CD version as well. So there's like one or two extra scenes and bits and pieces moved around. Um, but yeah, but I think you weren't as blown away as I was first time round with it.
I think it's because at this stage, we've had lots of different versions of Ace from Big Finish and in the books and comics and all
Yeah,
that kind of thing, and where she ends up, and a few of the ideas from this have been used elsewhere, and maybe even in a better way. I think um, it just took a little bit of getting into. It by the end, I was there, and I could sort of see, yes, this is a really, really interesting direction to take things, and I do like the idea that Time Lords have godlike powers that they just don't use, and it was using these powers was the thing that kind of did the Doctor in, and it is kind of I guess, an inevitable end for the Seventh Doctor actually, and it's something not dissimilar to what Big Finish are playing with in The Last Day. We've heard part one, obviously part two is a few months off yet, but I get the impression that they're trying to do something fairly similar here in terms of the Seventh Doctor, that kind of thing. But it felt like it took a while to get there. The very first scene in part one was big and explosive and a complete waste of Jacqueline Pearce, who's dead within the first 5 minutes.
well, the cast is amazing actually. Like,
Oh,
there's
the
a
cast
whole
is
load of different
incredible,
people.
yeah. Um,
Like,
but I saw Jacqueline Pearce and thought, oh yeah, brilliant. This will be good. Oh, she's dead. Okay.
well, Nicholas Courtney's in it as well. Like, is it for a line or two at the end?
Yeah, he had a good 10 seconds, if that. And again, like you say, it's there to set up a series in a Doctorless universe with the Minister of Chance and Ace and the Brigadier and all this kind of thing. And I do like that, but it just takes a while to get there, and there are some things in it that just kind of I'm not convinced they happen for a reason. You know, we're presented with a new companion who's dead within 4 episodes, and it's not even a particularly memorable death. The bad guy just sort of goes, "I'm going to kill him," and that's it. Um, and then immediately after that, the Doctor's reunited with Ace, who's sort of in Time Lord training up until that point, and there's an awful lot of stuff with her, and it doesn't really seem to go anywhere. Like, by the time Ace meets the Doctor, is she any different to the Ace that we've known before this story? Is she any different to the Ace that she was in part one? I'm not convinced the answer to that's yes. She's got a wand. Um, so yeah, don't get me wrong. Overall, I did enjoy this. I really did think it was a good and interesting thing to do. I can see why they did it. I can see what the aim of it was, and I think it's overall very, very well executed. There just seemed to be an awful lot of ideas in there being thrown about, and actually, maybe they
Yeah,
didn't all need to be there, or maybe more time was needed to explore them, or it felt like the finale to a series that didn't happen, which is exactly what it is, kind of. It's there's obviously a lot between Survival and this, or even the Big Finish stuff that was released up until that point, and this. Um, and I kind of wish that some of it would maybe have been expanded on. You know, the whole little sort of vampire storyline in the second episode, I think it was. I kind of wish that that had been stretched out a bit longer. We could have had more than that. That's kind of good. Doctor and Antimony just kind of operating as the Doctor and a companion would. And if we'd had more of that, I'd have been able to care about Antimony when he's eventually killed
mm.
a little bit more. As it was, oh, this character I met an hour and a half ago is gone. Okay, then. Um, so, yeah, I wish this had been the finale to a series and not just the finale to the Seventh Doctor. Just watch this telly stuff beforehand and assume some of the stuff happened since.
Yeah, I see that. I think like the reason that didn't stand out for me is that I think all those things are done, but with a shorthand. And yeah, maybe the impact would have been more if we'd had like a Big Finish box set and a trilogy of stories where you get to know Antimony um, and his background um, but I think it's there in the writing and also the performance. I think this is one of Sylvester McCoy's better performances, and I said that about the music and the production. I think that really carries it as well, just like the sound design and the music. I was thinking earlier today just how it, I just made the connection today that it reminds me of season 18 and uh, in Logopolis and like those last few Tom Baker stories, how just the music has this kind of bittersweet uh, tone that sort of fits with this theme of decay and entropy and things ending. And yeah, I really like it on a sort of production and story and ambition level. And I think maybe it would have been retrospective, but some of those things that you understandably picked up as being gaps, if it had gone to a series, maybe those could have been fleshed out retrospectively. Like we could have gotten flashbacks or more adventures and stuff with the vampires or the different, like that huge cast of characters that are set up in this story. So yeah, I think it's a real shame, like with Schalke, that this didn't carry on in some form.
I um I definitely think that it's worth me going back to, but I think if I went back to it, I'd go back and just do the audio. I think you can buy it
Yeah,
as just like an audio or get a CD on eBay or whatever. Because I think that actually audio, it was absolutely fantastic. I think the production was amazing. Like you say, the cast is exceptional. And I think the way to watch it in 2024 isn't a dodgy pirated copy on YouTube or a copy that somebody's attempted to upscale. I don't think watching it is the way to go at all, actually. I think that probably just listening to it and perhaps giving the visuals over to my own imagination might be, well, might have its advantages. So when I do it again, and I will do it again, I think I'm going to go just audio. I think that's probably the way forward for me on this one.
Yeah, and I think there are a few extra scenes in the audio version as well. And I mean, the visuals are interesting to take a look at, just like as a historical curio. And I'm not talking down the art, because I think, was it Lee Sullivan who did the artwork for them?
Yes,
But
yes, I think
it's
it was.
just again, it's like an emerging medium, and the animation. It's maybe generous to call it animation. It's like quite static images that are occasionally floating around the screen a little bit, if I remember rightly.
Yeah,
So it's more just like visuals, like accompanying an audio story.
I mean we have fan made stuff for Big Finish stuff now that completely eclipses this. Um, the Josh Snare's animation of Out of Time, for example,
Yeah,
it's light years ahead of what. And I know that this is 20 years later, but this is a fan project, whereas obviously Death Come to Time is something that was officially released by the BBC. So
yeah.
it's as a sort of historical artifact. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's very interesting to look at, but I genuinely don't think it's the best way to enjoy this story today.
I agree, and again, like I don't think it's any reflection on the artist. I think if you look at some of those images in isolation, they're quite nice. It's just
Yeah,
it doesn't quite work as like attempting to simulate video or motion.
yeah. I mean, it was a great effort, like you say, not to take away from any of the artwork at all. It looked brilliant, but it was little more than a loose cannon reconstruction, really, when you think
Yeah,
about it. Um, the opening titles were um, sort of a star field, a painted star field that occasionally just got a little bit brighter, and it wasn't in time with the music or anything. It seemed to be just on its own. Every now and again, it just sort of pulsated with a bit of light before going dark again, and then smash cut to a logo. Obviously, as we move on through these webcasts, the title sequences got a little bit more
elaborate.
dynamic.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was it's definitely a product of its time, and I think it's very clear that this is a first go as well as far as Doctor Who webcasts go. Um, we'll move on though, and we'll move on to. I'm just going to say it. It didn't improve on the second go. Let's get it out there. We'll move on to Real Time, which I have seen a couple of times before, and it's now that I've seen Death Comes to Time, I'd say Real Time is more of the same, but a story that's nowhere near as good.
Yeah,
I think.
it's got like elements that should have worked for me. Like Evelyn is one of my favorite companions. It's got
Yeah,
Lee and Herring in it as like two comedians who I really like. Um, it tries to do something different, but yeah, this doesn't come together very. Uh, I think it doesn't help it that it kind of ends. Those Doctor Who stories that are 6 parts, and like at the end of part 4, you think the story's finished, and then there's a twist, and there's another 2 episodes. It
yeah,
feels like we got the first 4 episodes of one of those, and they forgot to include the last two. Um,
yes.
that doesn't help it either. That it
It's
feels like a
it's almost like the Doctor just leaving the rat eating Leela in Talons of Weng Chiang. That's it. That's where the story ends.
or Invasion of
Uh,
Time. Like they just leave Gallifrey and
when the Sontarans
yeah,
show up,
yeah.
yeah, or whatever happens at the end of part 4, the Armageddon factor. I forget now. But yeah, it kind of it's on its own. It's all right. It's quite good. It fits into what Big Finish were doing at the time with the Sixth Doctor and Evelyn. Like you say, Evelyn's a great companion, and this is one of her weaker stories. There's no way around that. It's it's good to have an Evelyn Cyberman story. It's an interesting idea, and it's brutal. Like, this is far more violent than your normal Big Finish, and it's even take the visuals out of it. There's a lot of heads being crushed and bones cracking and blood flying all over the place, and the visuals kind of don't hold back on this as well. It's like, oh wow, the Cybermen are just popping people's heads to
Yeah.
kill them.
Did you watch
It's
the visual version of
yes,
this?
yes.
I'm
In
trying to
fact, I've
remember how
never
hard
heard
the.
it. I've never heard it on its own. I've only ever seen the
Yeah.
visual. And yeah, I was kind of taken a little back by just how far it goes. Like, if this story was made in, let's say it was made as part of the original season 23 or whatever, if it was made around the Sixth Doctor's time, it wouldn't have gone into that level of violence. Like, Attack of the Cybermen often gets called out for being violent, and I do think, with the Cybermen there should be some, a bit of blood and a bit of gore and a bit of horribleness. But
This was like
wow, yeah,
Torchwood class levels of like
yeah, it
blood and
was
gore.
absolutely, yeah.
I felt
Or
like in a bit
it,
sort of like an empty way. I felt like I didn't feel like it was just really, really violent and gory, and I don't know. I didn't really get to know the characters well enough to care when their heads got crushed.
well, yeah, I was about to say exactly the same thing. It's kind of, it's gory, it's horrible that all of these characters are meeting such grisly ends, but who are they? Because again, we've not spent much time with them. They've not been developed very well. They're just people that happen to be around for the Cybermen to brutally murder.
Hmm.
The thing that real time will always be remembered for, though, is perhaps the one thing they don't want real time to be remembered for, and that is the cliffhanger that it ends on. Because it turns out that the controller of these time traveling, are they time traveling Cybermen? They must be. I'm sure they
Yeah.
are. The controller of these Cybermen is Evelyn. I'm like, okay, wow, this is taking Evelyn in a whole new direction. Like, what's going to happen here? And how? Okay, we're never going to talk about it again. All right then. So do we assume that there's an off-screen story where it all gets wrapped up? And why did they work that cliffhanger in? Again, were they looking for this to turn into a series, despite the last one not turning into a series and then making this instead? Or I don't know where they were going with that. They'd have been better off just telling a contained 6-part story, and then if it ever did become a series, do something about it. But Big Finish didn't even pick up that cliffhanger when they had Evelyn as
And that
as a
yeah.
current main character.
And they made this for the BBC, like because the production sort of history of these different webcasts is interesting. Because Death Comes to Time was, I think, all like in-house BBC, but then this was put out as a BBC webcast, but it was made by Big Finish. So it feels like it should have been the easiest thing in the world to, and they put it out as a CD as well. It should have been the easiest thing in the world to do even just a single disc follow-up to wrap this up in some way, or even just a line somewhere to
Yeah,
address it or mention it.
you do wonder if there's some kind of licensing thing, because it's one of the very, very, very few now Big Finish things that's never made it to download. It's still CD only, isn't it?
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm looking at the page now. It's CD only.
So I'm going to assume that it was rights and licensing and that kind of thing, but it's a good cliffhanger. It's a memorable cliffhanger. We're talking about it 20 years later, but that's just where it ends. And as a result, last time I watched this, I actually did it as part of a Sixth Doctor and Evelyn run. I was listening to everything. I thought, well, I'll watch real time as part of it as well, just to see how it fits up. And there's just nothing. It is just business as usual on every other release. So yeah, completely ignored cliffhanger. I suppose one great thing that it did give us was the Six Doctors blue coat alternative.
Oh, was
That
this the
came from
debut?
here.
Oh,
I
okay.
think so, and I think it was done because all blue was easier to animate than
Oh,
the
yes, yeah,
usual
I remember.
monstrosity.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds familiar. Yeah, that's an
Um,
interesting bit of trivia.
and that's something that was obviously run with, and the Sixth Doctor having a blue coat has become fairly well established at Big Finish, and I believe this is where it started.
And in
Um,
toys, he's had uh, action figures and even those little Lego scale construction figures. There was a blue coat variant of the Sixth
yes,
Doctor.
yes. So it's at least we've got the blue coat.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, we can forgive it everything else for that.
so we've had two webcasts that never became series. I think what they did for this third one that we're about to discuss was actually quite clever, which was instead of coming up with a completely new story and ending it on a cliffhanger and paving the way for the future, they took what was the current Doctor at the time, Paul McGann, um, and they took Sharda, which, Douglas Adams, that's a name that's always going to do well. And they said, all right, well, let's do a complete version of Sharda with Paul McGann, and let's do something a bit different. And I think this is a runaway success. I think this is brilliant. This was my first version of Sharda. I hadn't seen the VHS version at this point, and to be perfectly honest, even when I had seen the VHS version, I considered this to be the default version until the animation came out on Blu-ray many, many years later. I think this works so well. Kind of the idea that the events of Sharda kind of got messed with, so sort of happened, sort of didn't, so that the Eighth Doctor and Romana have to retrace their steps. Um, what a great way of doing it, and it means we can still have Romana, we can still have K9. Let's be honest, if Tom was doing Big Finish at the time, it would totally have just been done as a Tom Baker story, but I like the fact that this is an extra bit of Paul McGann, and I like the fact that it's an extra bit of Paul McGann with Romana because they work together so flipping well. Um, so yeah, the Sharda webcast talked to us about that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I really like this one. I think it's really solid, and I was familiar with the VHS version with the linking Tom Baker segments, but I sort of slipped into just accepting this one very easily. It's interesting. I don't know if anyone's done like a side by side comparison, but like how Paul McGann sort of fits into a story and dialogue written for the Fourth Doctor really well. Like, there's moments where you sort of, if you know the existing footage of Sharda, you might have it a bit ingrained in your head that that's Tom Baker saying that, but generally it just comes across very natural. You mentioned like the dynamic with Romana, that is great, and they do get some stories together, but um, they don't get to have as much sort of fun in terms of just having a regular adventure like this. Um, and speaking of Romana, it's for her it's set when she is president of Gallifrey, um, but it's nice to have her have an opportunity to just be a little bit lighter and recapture some of her original character. And it's a deliberate choice. It's not a sort of criticism of the performance, but uh, a lot of Gallifrey is very grim and serious, and I think that gets reflected in how you hear uh, Romana come across in that series. So it's nice to have this little example of the character set later in her life, but capturing some of that sort of youthful tone and sense of fun from the TV series. Um, yeah, and the rest of the cast are great. I think is it Andrew Sachs as Sally Avon? Um,
Skagra.
Skagra, sorry, yeah, and yeah, and there's a few other sort of notable names as well. Like with a lot of these webcasts, they get some really good people in for small or medium-sized parts, and yeah, just a really solid story. I think the animation, they made sort of small improvements in terms of like how dynamic or ambitious it was, but we're still talking for these first three. They're all kind of a piece in terms of the artist and like the style of animation being. It's like visuals accompanying a primarily audio story, whereas Scream of the Shellcall, that we'll get onto, is designed as as a a visual story. It's very different.
Yeah, it's. I mean, it's another Big Finish production. This, so it literally is a Big Finish audio that they put some visuals to. Um, Again, I've never actually listened to this just on its own. I've always watched it with the animation, and again, I think I probably get a lot more out of it now if I were to just listen to the audio. But I definitely think that this was sort of a worthwhile undertaking. At the time, this was the only way we were ever going to get a complete version of Sharda. I know that we're sat here now talking with sort of 50 different versions all ready to watch at any point. And there's a book and there's an audio book and all this kind of thing. But back then, it was the VHS, it was the few clips in the Five Doctors, and that was Sharda. It was still this kind of mostly missing, well, not mostly missing, but partially missing kind of what could have been. And this kind of gave us a hell of a lot more than anything else that we had. So I'm really glad this existed. And, I remember watching it online. It'll have been after it came out. I think I probably went to it as soon as I'd finished Schalke when that first came out. I went to this and thought, this is just fantastic. This is really what I want. I want, more Paul McGann. It was probably the only Paul McGann I'd ever seen or heard apart from the movie at that point. And yeah, it was just great. Like, we had this new Doctor, but he was with Romana and K9, and they were sort of living through this old story that
Yeah,
never quite made it.
and that retcon was quite deft. I thought they have a scene at the start, they explain it, and then they get on with pretty much directly adapting the original story. So they kind of have their cake and eat it by making it fit for people who care about continuity and sort of hand waving that, and then they just get on and do like a relatively faithful performance of the script of Sharda with like just a few tweaks here and there.
And I mean, it has been a little while since I last saw it, but am I right in thinking that they actually use the plot device of Sally Avin being able to edit memories and stuff as the reason that the original Sharda's missing, as it were?
Um, I think it was. I listened to it relatively recently. I think it was more the Five Doctors that they were pulled out of their time stream for the Game of
Yes,
Rassilon,
that's
and
right.
then that disrupted them taking part in the events of Sharda that should have happened in the Fourth Doctor's life.
Yes, that's right. It's the Five Doctors that did it. Although I like my idea now. Half of it happened and then Sally Avin wiped it out. They could have gone with that. So many options. I mean, I think really what we've proved is that we just need another version of Sharda where this gets implemented because we don't have enough. um, One thing I'll never forget about this, just before we move on, one thing I'll never forget about this is there were sort of kind of they were obviously aping DVD special features that went on the website with this one. And one of these special features, dare I say it, pretty much the only special feature, was a very, very short music video. And it was Kylie's Can't Get You Out of My Head, accompanied by Romana driving along in a car. Wonderful bit of randomness. Well done, BBC, BBCI, whoever it was that did it, for coming up with that. Absolutely no need at all, but what a cute idea. You've got these kind of like 30-second clip extras that go along with the episodes themselves. And I thought, they were obviously kind of looking at expanding these webcasts, I guess. And so we'll move on now. We'll move on to Scream of the Schalke, which is, I mean, it's a whole different league to the three we've discussed already. This is near enough a full-blown animation. In fact, if I remember correctly, it was Cosgrove Hall that did this, who also did the animation for The Invasion, the two missing episodes of The Invasion when it came out on DVD. So it's kind of gone to a proper production company at this point. It's not just being done by people at the BBC or whatever. So Scream of the Schalke was brave. Richard E. Grant is the Ninth Doctor now. This is the Ninth Doctor. It's a continuation. Paul McGann has regenerated at some point. Welcome to this whole new official, definitely the Ninth Doctor era. And before he could even make it on screen, Doctor Who was coming back and Richard E. Grant was not going to be the Ninth Doctor. Christopher Eccleston was. So what we have is this kind of unbound Ninth Doctor that never happened, and it's not the perfect story at all. But what we have got is it's written by Paul Cornell, who would very, very soon go on to write for the TV series. We've got a new Doctor, we've got a new companion, we've got Derek Jacobi as the Master. What a brilliant idea. The Master is actually a robot travelling in the Doctor's TARDIS. That's a mystery that just never gets solved. And we've got quite a good monster in the Schalke. They're, sort of magma parasite creatures that invade planets from below. There's a lot happening here. It's not exceptional. It's not, it's certainly not sort of on the level of quality of the animations that we have for Missing Stories that we seem to get semi-regularly now. But it's nevertheless far, far, far more animated than the three we've discussed already. It's a really interesting piece, and I really do think that were Doctor Who not coming back, this is probably what we'd have got for a while.
Yeah, that was the plan. They were going to do a series of these, and I think they had some outlines even for the next few stories, but it was all scuppered by it coming back to TV.
I know, damn Russell T Davies just ruining it.
It wasn't like that critical, but I remember Russell T Davies not being blown away with Richard E. Grant's performance in this. What did you think of how he is as the Doctor?
I had no problem with it.
I thought it's fine. It's not.
I think the sort of criticism I've often seen levelled at it is it sounds like it's been phoned in.
Yeah.
And I can kind of understand that, but at the same time, this was meant to be the first time he was establishing the character and how he was going to go on for a series. I think it was originally meant to be a 3-story series that then got cut to 2 stories and then got cut to 1 story, but that story was a 6-parter instead of a 4-parter. So it was a troubled production from day one. And I think that, we'd have got 2 or 3 stories out of Richard E. Grant, we'd have perhaps, found our way into a more interesting performance, a more interesting Doctor. Not every Doctor has been completely there during their first story. It's like taking Christmas Invasion and going, oh, is that it for David Tennant as the Doctor? Didn't do much. Not much happened there. And if you take the first 4 episodes as the first Doctor, you have not got the first Doctor's character. If you take Power of the Daleks, you've not got the second Doctor. Spearhead from Space, Pertwee's unconscious for the first half. So it's okay, Tom Baker's completely there already in Robot, but that's Tom Baker. Castrovalva, okay, fine. It was the third, fourth, I can't remember which exactly it was that Davison recorded. And then you see him in Four to Doomsday and you go, oh no, he's not there yet. So to expect any Doctor to be fully there in their first stories, it's a bit of a daft criticism, I think. I wish we'd have got more Richard E. Grant.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there as well. Like, I mean, because Christmas Invasion, the Doctor's unconscious most of it, and we do get a fair bit of this a feel for who this new Doctor is. And I do agree he might have had a chance to bed into the performance, particularly as I don't think he'd really heard of Doctor Who when he was offered the role. So there was that, and um, but yeah, like uh, you mentioned, like there being bits of it that didn't quite work, or like I think the aliens are fine. They're sort of on the level of yeah, again, like with Christmas Invasion, they're sort of on the level of the threat with the aliens we have there. Kind of, they serve a purpose. They get the plot moving. They create a threat. Um, and it reminded me of Rose quite a lot as well. The episode in that the alien threat is actually not the important bit. The important bit is introducing the new companion, the new Doctor, and their dynamic. Um, and I think it did some of that really well. Like I wanted to see more of that TARDIS team, especially with the Master in the mix as well. Um, and and there were a lot. I rewatched it today, and there was like some really interesting parallels with a lot of what we would then see on screen from 2005 onwards. Um, just the scene at the end where Alison's leaving her boyfriend, it's kind of like a much more mature, grown up version of Rose running into the TARDIS and just abandoning a traumatized Mickey.
Yeah.
Alison has like a sort of quite adult conversation with him, and they come to an understanding that she's moving on, she's going to go travel with the Doctor, whereas Rose kind of leaves Mickey on the floor and just like runs beaming into the TARDIS and flies off. Um, so that was an interesting contrast, and there's so many little trappings that I picked up on that feel very new series, like the Doctor having a mobile phone, the kind of like off the wall ending of using singing to defeat the aliens. Um, they don't call it a time war, but some sort of massive trauma or event that serves exactly the same purpose as the time war, in terms of like putting the Doctor in a bit of a dark, lonely place and needing to come out of it. Um, yeah, this could have been like an alternative version of the new series that we had a few years later. I think there's so many little modern bits to it. You can see that it's like written by someone who's coming from the same sort of mindset as Russell was, and they both Paul Cornell and Russell wrote for the New Adventures and kind of participated in all that sort of spin-off media in the 90s as well.
Yeah, I think that you're right there. Actually, there's a lot that Schalke does right, or at least is on the way to doing right, and then would be done really, really well in the new series when it came along. And you're absolutely right, actually, about Alison for going into the TARDIS for the first time. It's probably actually better handled than Rose and Mickey. Even the idea of a companion leaving their boyfriend to travel with the Doctor, though, stuff like that. There are definite parallels there. It's also it's got unit in it, but it's not a unit story, which again is something that the new series does fairly often, even now does fairly often. Like, they're there, they're present, they're doing unity things, but the Doctor's not reporting to them. He's not bobbing back to HQ once an episode to explain bits of the plot or whatever happened in the Pertwee era. It's even the way units are handled, I think, is very, very sort of New Who. It's a really interesting insight, and it is kind of this embryonic new series of Doctor Who, and it just, I wish we'd have seen a little bit more, or wish that it had been recognised, or I imagine that Big Finish trying to get Richard E. Grant to, carry on with some Unbound stories will probably be a rights and logistical nightmare, and also, it's Richard E. Grant, he's pretty much on top of the world at the moment in terms of the roles he's getting. Um, yeah, it's. I'm always going to wish there was more. I'm always going to wish that it wasn't just Schalke and that the story continued and that we learnt a bit more about the Master. And I think it has actually been followed up in, is it a
There was a
book or a
short.
comic or something?
There was a short story. There's a novelization that was put out by BBC Books, and then there was also a short story that had something to do with vampires, or it was
Yeah.
put on the BBC website. Um, but yeah, I'd also love to see more of this, and yeah, it might be a bit of an obstacle for Big Finish, but maybe a comic or another book or something. Again, comes back to what I said before, that like it, that sort of spin-off media that is a bit unusual or takes risks or takes things in a different direction just interests me a lot more than just kind of replicating what we've already had on TV dozens of times.
I suppose if Big Finish were ever to go anywhere near this or even allowed to, they've already got one of the three regulars on board playing the Master.
Yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah.
so that's a start.
Yeah, we could have a origin story for the robot master. There's another little new series detail that I spotted, which is some kind of like hinted Doctor Master shipping with like their little answer phone message where they seem to be getting drunk together and leaving a voicemail message for
Yes.
people calling the TARDIS phone. So yeah, there's so many little bits that would come back to be like recurring things on TV that you can see in this. So it's like
Oh, and
a really
David Tennant's in it as well. That's
yeah.
probably worth mentioning. He's in it for a few seconds. He's like unit soldier number 4 in the corner or something like that. But
Yeah, yeah,
um, David Tennant is in it, which is a little bit of a new series link, just a little bit.
yeah. So that's a trivia question. What's the earliest episode to feature David Tennant as and Derek Jacobi as the Master?
Yes, that's going in a pub quiz one day. Um, yeah, but yeah, I'm always going to have a soft spot for Schalke, and I'm always going to be willing to kind of overlook any faults that are there because it was new Doctor Who to me when it came out.
I like the
Um,
animation actually. You said like
it yeah, it's lovely.
I think like even compared to some of the like more recent ones, I feel like the quality of the recent ones that we've had for me it goes up and down a little bit, and even if the sort of technical animation in Schalke is cruder, I feel like there's a lot of life and creativity put into the visual design that carries it, and that it's coming from a studio that did stuff like Danger Mouse and really like well loved children's cartoons, and I think you can see that sort of creativity in the designs come through.
It was a very sad day when Cosgrove Hall kind of stopped because they did do some great stuff, and I'd have loved to have seen some more missing episode reconstructions from them.
Yeah, the invasion ones were really good. Yeah, they kind of set a really high bar. Maybe that's the thing. Like the invasion ones were so good that it set quite a high bar for the other other ones to meet, which I think sometimes they have met. But yeah, it was a really strong start.
I honestly think Invasion's going to take some beating. Actually, if I were to watch all of the animations together,
Mm.
I think I'd come out preferring the Invasion over all the others. But I think it's the style that Cosgrove Hall, for Doctor Who at least, had a fairly sort of consistent art style. You know, the Invasion doesn't look a million miles different to Schalke, and they both work very, very well. And I really liked the way they drew characters and expressions and that sort of thing. So yeah, it was a real shame when they went because I'd have loved to have got a lot more Doctor Who, no matter how it had been. Be it something like Schalke or a reconstruction of a missing episode or whatever.
Yeah, the invasion ones were
I
like
just wish there was more.
yeah, you're right. They're like the invasion ones were like that perfect balance of recognizable as the actors, so it slots in amongst the surviving episodes, but expressive enough to take advantage of the medium of animation and not try to make animation look photorealistic because that can end up looking awkward.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so we've talked about our four webcasts. Which do you think's the best of the bunch?
I think Death Comes to Time is my favourite, but I really like Sharda as a really sort of solid, like you said, complete version of that story, and I really like um, Scream of the Sharka. I feel like I'm like uh, being unfair
Anything
to
but
real
real
time.
time.
I like real time for giving us the blue coat.
There you go. The blue coat saved it.
But like yeah, like we said before, like these there was such a sort of interesting experimental interesting run of stories, both in like sort of on screen, then also just the sort of fascinating production history and twists and turns of like the behind the scenes stuff. And like Death Comes to Time was meant to be a Radio 4 thing initially, and then it was turned down. And so like this weird new medium was a little kind of testing ground for like Doctor Who that was a bit too weird to be on like proper radio or proper TV at the time.
Yeah, and each one has its own merits. Each one works, or does what it's trying to do. Real time definitely has its faults, and it's a shame that, like I said earlier, we never quite got that follow up.
The end of the story.
Well, yeah. Um, I think ultimately I'd have to pick Sharda as my favourite because
Yeah.
it just achieves on every level, and the animation's never going to blow anyone away. It wasn't even going to blow anyone away at the time, but it had to be fairly simple because it had to be viewed on dial-up connections. Um, but Schalke's in a close second, and just the sheer ambition, the sheer balls of Schalke. We've got a new Doctor. The Doctor is Richard E. Grant now. We're starting a series with him. This is new Doctor Who. This is it. That's what it set out to be. It was never meant to be this sort of one-off oddity. It was supposed to be a big, bold Doctor Who is back. This is new Doctor Who statement.
Well, they explicitly, yeah, it wasn't just implicit. I think they actually said that in the marketing and interviews, and that's what made it like even more unfortunate that it very rapidly then wasn't. But yeah, I remember stuff about this is the continuation of Doctor Who. This is the Ninth Doctor.
Wasn't there even a Richard E. Grant is the Doctor DWM cover?
Uh, yeah, that sounds familiar.
I'm
So
fairly sure
yeah,
it got the proper Doctor Who magazine is the Doctor cover. I'd have to look into that. I'm sure there was a cover with him on. I'd be very surprised if it wasn't, and if that is the Doctor type cover. But yeah, just I love Schalke for just being so ballsy with announcing itself as this is the new Doctor, this is Doctor Who now, and it's in some ways it's a shame that somebody else came along and went, no, this is new Doctor Who now, and we're actually going to be on telly, and we've got Christopher Eccleston and Billie Piper. And that's the only reason Schalke wasn't new Doctor Who now. So, yeah, Sharda, I think, is, in terms of what it achieves based on what it set out to achieve, I think Sharda's definitely the winner, but I think that Schalke is definitely a close runner-up. And one thing I am going to do, based on sort of watching Death Comes to Time for the first time today, is find the Minister of Chance audio series, which I know is sort of one of those up in the air. Does it not count? Is it set in the Whoniverse or not, etc.? But the character's got me intrigued. I think it's a very good character. And it was great to have Stephen Fry in Doctor Who many, many years before Stephen Fry was in Doctor Who for not enough time.
yeah, it's one of the many characters that's set up in that story that, yeah, like you said, could have had lots of exploration in an ongoing series if the BBC had carried it on.
Yep, but alas, the webcasts are consigned to history. And we won't be seeing another. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, which I'm sad about. Like I've heard The Last Day Part 1 from Big Finish, and I want to reserve judgment until we've heard Part 2. But um, I know like very few people would have bought it, but I would have liked them just to have done like a sequel or follow up to Death Comes to Time, as like the big swan song at Big Finish, and kind of follow up on all these interesting characters and threads, and get Stephen Fry back, um, and yeah, have explore Ace taking up the Doctor's mantle, and yeah, so all that kind of that sort of tantalizing possibility of how things could have gone. That's part of the reason I picked Death Comes to Time as my favourite.
And it's certainly toying with some of the themes and ideas. That it's obviously been in the writer's mind when they were coming up with The Last Day Part 1, but so was everything else Big Finish have ever done with the Seventh Doctor. And
Yeah,
then some.
yeah, like Death Comes to Time is quite expansive in the number of threads and characters, but a lot of them are original to that story, and they're introduced in some way to tell you who they are. Like I said, I don't want to say too much about The Last Day until the second half has come out, but yeah, there's a lot of homework I think you need to do to fully follow what's happening in that release.
Yeah, we'll see what Part 2 brings, but it's definitely a different beast to any of these. Well, it's been really interesting talking about these because they were a very, well, certainly Sharda and Shalka were a very sort of big part of my my childhood when there was no Doctor Who. I got into this series that just wasn't around at all. And then all of a sudden it was, and it was animated and online, and it did feel cutting edge, and it did feel like it was exploring something new and exciting. But then Rose came along, and it just couldn't hold a candle to Rose. Proper Doctor Who on the telly, unbeatable. But yeah, it's certainly been interesting looking at this, and we shall delve into the archives for another episode like this in future. We've done BBC Radio, we've done webcasts. What should we explore next? What weird corners of historical Doctor Who that never quite came off?
Audiovisuals, BBV,
PC games, Destiny of the Doctors. It was brilliant.
Doctor Who Top Trumps.
On the PlayStation 2. But for now, we shall leave it there. So thanks very much for joining me to talk about these, Mansoor. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, same. Thank you.
And we'll be back for more spellcasting soon. Goodbye now.